My name is Zara Monroe. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I have worked in compliance and risk strategy for a mid-sized financial firm in London. On paper, my role sounds authoritative. In reality, I have always existed in the background, the quiet analyst in the corner office with the glass walls, the woman people greet politely, but rarely truly see. Most people describe me the same way: calm, agreeable, steady. I've been told I have a soothing presence. I've also been told, though never directly to my face, that I'm not ambitious in the aggressive way that gets you noticed. I don't dominate meetings. I don't interrupt. I don't perform confidence. I embody restraint. And in corporate spaces, restraint is often mistaken for weakness. For years, I let that misunderstanding exist, not because I lacked strength, but because I believed competence would speak for itself. I believed documentation mattered more than declarations. I believed integrity, over time, would quietly build its own shield. This story is not about revenge. It isn't about a dramatic takedown or a public humiliation. There are no shouting matches, no explosive confrontations in boardrooms. This is a story about perception. It's about what happens when someone assumes your silence is submission. It's about the moment a line is crossed. Not loudly, not violently, but with a sentence spoken too confidently by the wrong person. And it's about what quiet preparation looks like when it has been underestimated for far too long. Over the course of this story, you'll see how small dismissals accumulate, how subtle disrespect normalizes itself, how a professional threat can be delivered in a tone so casual it almost feels polite, and how power, when it shifts, doesn't always announce itself with noise. There was a moment when someone believed they could erase my reputation with a whisper. There was also a moment, later, when that whisper never had the chance to leave the room. I won't dramatize what happened. I won't exaggerate emotions for effect. I'll tell you exactly what I saw, what I documented, what I chose, and what that choice cost everyone involved. Because sometimes dominance isn't loud. Sometimes it's procedural. Have you ever been underestimated so consistently that people forgot you were paying attention? Before the threat, before the investigation, before anyone realized the floor beneath them was shifting. To them, I was useful. That was the word, if we're being honest. Not impressive, not threatening, not particularly influential. Useful. I was the one who stayed late to double-check regulatory filings. The one who remembered which clause had been amended in 2018 and which exceptions still applied under transitional arrangements. I was the person managers looped into emails when something had gone slightly wrong and needed cleaning up. But I was rarely invited into the room when decisions were first being made. In meetings, my presence functioned like insurance. If I were there, it meant the paperwork would hold. It meant someone responsible was watching the margins. Yet when I spoke, the room often responded with polite nods rather than engagement. Good point, Zara. We'll circle back to that. Let's not get too technical. Those phrases became background noise. My manager, Daniel, was particularly skilled at reframing my input as reinforcement rather than authorship. If I raised a concern, he would rephrase it 5 minutes later with slightly stronger language and receive gratitude for his strategic foresight. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But I also understood something most people don't. Influence is not always visible in real time. So I observed. I kept notes. I documented meeting outcomes versus initial risk assessments. I archived emails where guidance had been softened for commercial flexibility. I saved calendar invites where compliance reviews were shortened from 90 minutes to 20, not because I anticipated conflict, because I believed in clarity. To my colleagues, I was dependable and emotionally neutral. I didn't gossip. I didn't align myself with factions. When office tensions flared, I remained steady, which, ironically, made me easy to overlook. Calm people are often mistaken for passive ones. I dressed simply, tailored blazers, neutral tones, no dramatic accessories. I never competed for attention, visually or verbally. In a culture that rewarded charismatic assertiveness, my restraint translated into a background hum. There were moments when junior staff would approach me privately for advice. They trusted my discretion. They sensed the difference between noise and authority. But publicly, my role remained contained. Daniel once described me in a leadership meeting, unaware that I would later see the transcript, as solid operational support. Operational support, not a strategic partner, not a risk architect. Support. It wasn't said with malice. That's what made it more revealing. It was a sincere belief. In his mind, I ensured the machine ran smoothly. I wasn't someone who could stop it, and that perception shaped how he treated me. Deadlines were adjusted without my input. Risk thresholds were stretched because we can tidy that later. Occasionally, I would receive decisions after they had already been approved, followed by a casual, "Just formalize this." Each time I corrected what I could, quietly. Each time I reminded myself that credibility compounds over years, not days. But something subtle was forming beneath the surface. When you are consistently placed in a supporting role, you begin to understand the architecture of the stage better than anyone else. You see where the weight is carried. You see which beams are decorative and which ones actually hold the building up. And you realize something uncomfortable. If you stepped away, truly stepped away, certain structures would not stand. They believed I needed the visibility they controlled. They didn't consider that I understood the framework more intimately than they ever would. I wasn't resentful. I was attentive. There's a difference. Looking back now, I can see how predictable it all was. The dynamic, the hierarchy, the quiet assumptions. They saw steadiness. They mistook it for compliance. They saw restraint. They mistook it for a limitation. And when someone mistakes your discipline for dependency, they eventually test how far they can stretch it. That test was coming. I just didn't know yet how casually it would be delivered. The first cut wasn't loud. It didn't come with a raised voice or a slammed door. There was no audience, no dramatic pause. It arrived in the form of a forwarded email. Subject line, client acceleration proposal, time sensitive. Daniel had already responded by the time it reached me. I could see his reply at the top of the thread. Looks workable. Let's move quickly. Zara will confirm compliance positioning. Confirm compliance positioning. I read the attached proposal twice, then a third time. The client wanted to fast-track onboarding for a high-value portfolio, bypassing certain enhanced due diligence steps on the basis of also long-standing industry familiarity. The revenue projections were generous. The timeline was ambitious. The compliance shortcuts were subtle, but unmistakable. It wasn't illegal, but it was risky. And more importantly, it directly contradicted an internal policy update I had authored just 6 months prior. A policy Daniel had publicly praised as future-proofing the firm. I walked to his office with my notebook in hand. He was on a call when I arrived, pacing slightly, voice warm and animated. He gestured for me to wait. When he finished, he smiled in that relaxed, almost indulgent way he often did. "Zara, quick one?" I placed the printed proposal on his desk. "This accelerates onboarding by removing enhanced source of funds verification," I said calmly. "We updated the policy precisely to avoid discretionary exceptions like this." He leaned back. "It's a strategic client. I understand, but if we carve out an exception, we need documented rationale and board-level sign-off." He sighed. "Not dramatically, just enough to signal inconvenience." "You're technically right," he said. "But we can interpret the policy with some flexibility. That's why we have judgment." Judgment, the word lingered between us. "I'm comfortable documenting risk acceptance," I replied, "but it needs to be explicit." He smiled again, thinner this time. "Zara, sometimes you see risk where there's simply opportunity." It was subtle, polite, almost affectionate in tone, but there it was. A reframing. My caution was recast as oversensitivity. My diligence is recast as a limitation. I didn't argue. I didn't escalate. I simply nodded once. "Understood. I'll draft a formal risk acknowledgement memo for sign-off." His eyebrows lifted slightly, not in anger, but in mild surprise. "That might be excessive. It ensures alignment." He paused for a fraction of a second, then shrugged. "Fine. Keep it light. Keep it light." As if documentation were decorative, I returned to my desk and began drafting. Not a confrontational memo, not accusatory, just factual. Policy reference. Proposed deviation. Risk category, mitigation gaps, required approvals. When I circulated it for sign-off, the tone in the follow-up emails shifted. Less enthusiasm, more careful wording. The client onboarding was delayed by a week. No one openly criticized me, but I noticed something small. In the next leadership meeting, Daniel presented the successful onboarding, mentioning a few internal adjustments that had briefly slowed progress. He didn't reference the policy. He didn't reference risk assessment. He smiled when he said, "We managed to strike the right balance." Balance! The room nodded approvingly. I sat at the end of the table listening. It wasn't the omission that stayed with me. It was the pattern. That moment taught me something important. Not that I was wrong, not that I was right, but that my role would always be framed as friction, unless I chose when and how to apply it. That was the first cut. Small, professional, easy to dismiss, and easy for everyone else to ignore. But I remembered the phrasing. I remembered the tone. And I began to notice how often judgment meant bypassing structure, and how often I was expected to absorb the risk silently. That email thread is still in my archive, dated, time-stamped, unedited, because the first cut rarely bleeds immediately. Sometimes it just marks the place where pressure will be applied later. After that first email thread, nothing dramatic changed. That's how normalization works. There was no open hostility, no reprimand, no performance review questioning my approach. In fact, Daniel continued to describe me as thorough and detail-oriented in public settings. He even praised my protective instincts during one quarterly meeting. But the framing shifted, subtly. Whenever timelines tightened, compliance was described as the final hurdle. Whenever revenue targets were discussed, risk controls were referred to as necessary constraints. And whenever I raised questions, they were positioned as reminders rather than decision-shaping insights. It sounds small. It is small. That's what makes it effective. In one meeting, a colleague joked lightly, "We'll run it past Zara's risk radar first." The room laughed. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't malicious. But it carried an undertone, as if my presence represented delay rather than direction. I smiled politely. I made a note in my notebook later, not of the joke itself, but of the shift in perception. Language reveals hierarchy more than titles do. Over time, Daniel began looping me into conversations later and later in the process. Decisions would be 80% formed before they reached my desk. My job became less about shaping strategy and more about validating outcomes that were already emotionally committed. When I suggested earlier involvement, he responded smoothly. "We don't want to bog you down in commercial noise. We'll bring you in when it's relevant." Relevant, as if regulatory exposure were a postscript rather than a foundation. I told myself it wasn't personal, and in many ways it wasn't. Daniel was ambitious. He valued momentum. He thrived in high visibility negotiations. To him, friction, even principled friction, felt like resistance. And because I didn't push back loudly, my objections were easy to categorize as manageable. I rationalized staying quiet. I told myself this was strategic patience. I reminded myself that escalation without necessity damages credibility. Choosing every battle ensures you win none. But beneath that rationalization, something else was forming. A question. At what point does professionalism become permission? There was another moment, smaller, almost forgettable. A regulatory update had been released that materially affected one of our product lines. I flagged it immediately and recommended we pause marketing until we adjusted disclosures. Daniel skimmed the summary and replied, "Let's not overreact. We've interpreted similar guidance before." Interpreted, a soft word for stretching boundaries. I didn't argue. Instead, I requested written confirmation that the business was comfortable proceeding without immediate adjustment. I framed it as clarity, not resistance. He responded after a few hours. "Fine, proceed as discussed." 3 words. Short, efficient, and once again, the burden shifted quietly back onto me to formalize risk language. Each time this happened, a pattern solidified. He would push the boundary. I would document it. He would soften the framing. I would preserve the record. There were no raised voices, no hostile exchanges, just a steady rhythm of advancement and containment. To outsiders, our working relationship looked functional. We weren't adversaries. We weren't friends either. We were professionals orbiting the same objectives with slightly different tolerances. But I began to understand something that made me uneasy. Daniel believed he understood my limits. He believed I would always raise concerns, but ultimately align. He believed my silence meant acceptance. He believed my restraint meant predictability. And predictability, in corporate power dynamics, is often mistaken for controllability. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me attentive in a different way. I stopped assuming misunderstandings would self-correct. I stopped assuming integrity was self-evident. Instead, I began mapping exposure. Not emotionally, structurally. Which decisions required sign-off? Which approvals bypassed formal channels? Which client concessions stretched policy language beyond defensible interpretation? I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I still smiled. I still nodded. I still delivered documentation precisely on time. But internally, I shifted from participant to observer. Because once disrespect becomes normalized, even in polished language, it rarely reverses itself. It escalates, and I had a quiet sense that escalation was no longer hypothetical. There's a moment in every professional environment when you realize the role you've been cast in, not the one on your contract, the one in people's minds. For me, that moment didn't arrive with confrontation. It arrived with consistency. I was the stabilizer, the safety net, the internal conscience that could be consulted and overridden. I began to notice how conversation shifted when I entered a room. Energy recalibrated, language became slightly more careful. Riskier ideas were softened or framed as just initial thoughts. But when I wasn't there, those same ideas progressed further. I wasn't being excluded entirely. I was being sequenced. There's a difference. In one quarterly planning session, I watched it happen in real time. Daniel outlined an aggressive expansion strategy into a new market segment. The projections were optimistic. The compliance requirements are complex. When I asked whether we had conducted a preliminary regulatory compatibility assessment, he smiled, that patient, reassuring smile. That's why you're here. The room chuckled lightly. It sounded like appreciation. It wasn't. It was containment. My presence signaled that risk would be tidied at the end, that structure would be applied after ambition had already shaped direction. Reliable, useful, invisible. That was the role. No one said it directly, but I felt it in the cadence of meetings. Who received credit, and whose objections were reframed as healthy debate versus whose were labeled operational caution. I was not seen as a decision maker. I was seen as a validator. And validators by design operate after the fact. For a while, I told myself that this positioning gave me influence without exposure, that staying out of political crossfire preserved neutrality. That power doesn't always need a spotlight. But then something subtle shifted inside me. I realized that while I was protecting the institution, no one was protecting the function. Compliance was treated as elastic, adjustable, interpretable. And because I embodied that function publicly, my perceived flexibility became symbolic. If Zara is calm, it must not be serious. If Zara hasn't escalated, it must be manageable. If Zara is still here, nothing catastrophic can be happening. I became a signal, and I hadn't consciously agreed to that. The most revealing moment came during a leadership dinner. It was informal, no slides, no agendas, just a conversation over wine. One of the directors, relaxed and candid, said lightly, "We're lucky to have Zara. She keeps us out of jail." Laughter followed. Daniel added, "And she never panics, even when we push things a little." Push things a little. The phrase settled into me with quiet clarity. Not anger. Clarity. They believed I existed to absorb risk expansion, that I would stretch policy language until it accommodated ambition, that my steadiness was infinite, that my tolerance was elastic. They did not see me as someone who could say no in a way that halted momentum. They saw me as someone who would find a way to make yes safer. That's the role I had been assigned. And the most dangerous part? I had played it well, because I valued institutional stability, because I believed in proportional response, because I didn't mistake ego for authority. But I began asking myself a new question. What happens when the stabilizer decides not to compensate? What happens when reliability becomes conditional? I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change tone. I didn't withdraw cooperation. Externally, nothing shifted. Internally, something recalibrated. I stopped seeing myself as support. I started seeing myself as infrastructure. And infrastructure, when misused, doesn't shout. It simply withdraws structural reinforcement. That understanding didn't make me reactive. It made me patient in a different way. Because roles assigned without your consent can be reshaped, quietly, deliberately, and without announcement. The question was no longer whether boundaries would be tested. It was when and how far, and I had a growing sense that the next test would not be subtle. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't happen during a disagreement. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon under fluorescent lighting, with rain streaking the windows of our office. Daniel had asked me to step into his office for a quick alignment. His tone was neutral, casual. The kind of phrasing that suggests routine calibration rather than tension. When I sat down, he didn't offer coffee. He didn't close the blinds. He stayed standing for a moment, then leaned against his desk. It's a posture that felt conversational but slightly elevated. "We need to talk about perception," he began. Perception, an interesting word choice. He explained that some of the senior leadership team felt compliance had become overly cautious, that my documentation process was creating hesitation. The clients were noticing slight delays. He spoke gently, almost sympathetically. "I know you're protecting us," he said, "but sometimes we need to show confidence." Confidence, as if measured risk assessment signaled doubt. I listened without interrupting. Then he said something that changed everything.
If
"If you keep pushing back this hard, people will start questioning whether you're commercially aligned." It was subtle, polished, but it wasn't feedback. It was a warning, not about performance, about loyalty. The room felt very still in that moment, not tense, just precise. I asked calmly, "Are you suggesting I reduce documentation?" He hesitated, just briefly. "I'm suggesting you calibrate it. We don't want you developing a reputation as obstructive." Reputation, that word landed differently, because until that moment, disagreement had been framed as a stylistic difference. Judgment calls, interpretation. Now it was personal. Now it was about how I would be perceived in the industry. And in our sector, perception travels faster than facts. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. There is a specific sensation when a line becomes visible, a line that had been blurry until someone steps too close to it. He believed he was managing me, encouraging alignment, protecting the firm's momentum. But what he was actually doing was testing whether I would prioritize comfort over compliance. And for the first time, I understood something with absolute certainty. If anything went wrong, the narrative would not protect me. If a regulator questioned past decisions, documentation would suddenly become selective memory. If a client relationship soured, overly cautious could easily become difficult. And if leadership needed a pressure valve, I was positioned perfectly. Not because I had failed, because I had been framed. I looked at him and said evenly, "My role is to ensure we remain defensible under scrutiny. That requires documentation." He held my gaze for a second longer than usual. "I'm just saying, be careful how you're perceived." There it was again. Not advice, a caution. I nodded once. I always am. The meeting ended without raised voices, without hostility, without resolution. But something inside me had realigned. Up until that day, I believed we were navigating tension within shared values. After that day, I understood that our incentives were no longer aligned. He needed speed. I needed defensibility. He believed perception could be shaped socially. I believed it was shaped structurally. And if he was willing to suggest that my professional integrity could be reframed as obstruction, then I had to assume something more unsettling. He believed he could control the narrative. That was the moment the dynamic shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. Silence was no longer the default professionalism. It was becoming preparation. And preparation, when done properly, does not announce itself. After that conversation, I didn't escalate. I didn't file a complaint. I didn't request mediation. I didn't confront him about the undertone of that warning. I adjusted, but not in the way he expected. Outwardly, I softened nothing. I continued documenting. I continued referencing policy. I continued requesting written confirmations when deviations occurred. What changed was internal. My silence stopped being instinctive. It became deliberate. There's a difference between staying quiet because you trust the system and staying quiet because you are studying it. I began paying closer attention to how Daniel communicated when the stakes were higher. Which conversations did he avoid putting in writing? Which directives did he deliver verbally? Which risks he minimized with optimistic phrasing? Patterns sharpen when you stop participating emotionally. In meetings, I spoke slightly less. But when I did, I asked cleaner questions. Can you clarify who is accountable if this interpretation is later challenged? Should we record this as a formal exception to policy? Would you like me to summarize this decision for the minutes? Each question was neutral, procedural. But procedural language has weight. Sometimes he answered quickly, brushing it off. Other times he paused, recalibrating. What he didn't realize was that I was no longer trying to convince him. I was building context. Documentation became more precise. I began timestamping verbal directives and follow-up emails, just to confirm our discussion at 3:15 p.m. Per your guidance earlier today. It wasn't aggressive. It was clarity. And clarity over time builds architecture. Colleagues started noticing that I rarely reacted anymore. If a proposal skirted policy, I didn't express concern through tone. I simply referenced the clause and asked for confirmation. Some interpreted it as detachment, others as rigidity. Daniel, I suspect, interpreted it as compliance fatigue. He relaxed slightly. He began pushing further, assuming my calm indicated concession. That assumption was useful, because silence, when mistaken for weakness, encourages overextension. I also began having quiet conversations outside the firm. No complaints, not accusations. Just professional networking, industry forums, regulatory roundtables, informal coffees with former colleagues now working within oversight bodies. Not to report anything, just to listen, to understand enforcement trends, to observe how firms were being evaluated, to refine my own understanding of where interpretation ended and exposure began. The more I listened, the clearer something became. Our firm's recent flexibilities were not unique, but they were increasingly scrutinized across the sector, and reputations in compliance are rarely built on public praise. They're built on defensibility under audit. Daniel still believed the narrative was manageable. That perception could be adjusted internally. As long as performance targets were met, risk language would remain background noise. But I had stopped viewing the system internally. I was now mapping it externally. Silence had become strategic, not because I was planning retaliation, because I was preparing for inevitability. When someone warns you to be careful about your reputation, they are revealing how they think power works. They believe reputations can be shaped socially, whispered about, framed, managed. I believed something else. Reputation in regulated industries is preserved through evidence, and evidence accumulates quietly. By the end of that quarter, Daniel appeared more confident than ever. Revenue was strong. Client acquisition was accelerating. Leadership praised agility. He mistook the absence of resistance for alignment. He mistook my composure for surrender. He mistook documentation for bureaucracy rather than insurance. What he never noticed was that I had stopped thinking about internal optics. I was thinking about external scrutiny, and scrutiny, when it arrives, doesn't ask who seemed confident in the room. It asks who signed what. It asks who confirmed what. It asks who documented what. Silence at that point was no longer about preserving harmony. It was about positioning, and positioning is most powerful when no one realizes you've shifted. Preparation doesn't look dramatic. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed. By this point, Daniel had grown comfortable again. Revenue targets were being met. Leadership dinners felt celebratory rather than tense. The subtle friction between compliance and commercial teams had softened, at least on the surface. From the outside, I appeared even quieter than before. Inside, I was building something very different. I began organizing my records chronologically, not just by project, but by pattern. Verbal directives followed by written confirmations. Policy deviations categorized by risk level. Instances where enhanced due diligence was shortened. Meetings where concerns were minimized verbally, but acknowledged privately. I wasn't building a case. I was building clarity. There's a difference, because clarity isn't reactive. It doesn't wait for harm. It maps probability. I also adjusted how I participated in executive discussions. When expansion strategies were proposed, I didn't challenge projections. I asked about regulatory precedent in other jurisdictions. I referenced enforcement actions in similar firms, not accusatorily, but analytically. I noticed something interesting. When I cited external enforcement cases, Daniel's tone changed. Slightly sharper, slightly impatient. "We're not them," he would say. Of course we weren't, until we were. At industry events, I listened more than I spoke. A former colleague, now working in regulatory oversight, mentioned a recent increase in anonymous whistleblower submissions across the sector. Not dramatic scandals, patterns, documentation discrepancies, risk tolerance drift. That phrase stayed with me. Risk tolerance drift. It was subtle, incremental, hard to detect internally, but obvious from the outside. I didn't report anything. I didn't imply that I might. I simply absorbed information. Back at the office, I began refining my personal professional boundaries. I clarified in writing when I was advising versus when I was approving. I inserted language like, compliance advisory provided. Final commercial decision rests with management. Not defensively. Accurately, it wasn't about distancing myself from the firm. It was about precision and accountability. There was another change no one noticed. I stopped rescuing ambiguity. Previously, if a proposal contained vague language, I would rewrite it to align with regulatory standards before it left the building. Quietly correcting tone, strengthening disclaimers, adding clarifications. Now I flagged the ambiguity, and waited. Please confirm if this wording reflects your intended risk position. That shift mattered, because when people are required to explicitly own phrasing, they become more aware of its weight. Daniel occasionally responded with mild irritation. Do we need to spell everything out? Yes, I would reply gently. Clarity protects us. He still believed I was protecting the firm. He didn't realize I was also protecting the function and myself. There was one late evening when I sat alone in the office reviewing archived correspondence from the past year. Not obsessively, systematically. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was looking for a trajectory. And the trajectory was clear. Policy flexibility had increased. The documentation tone had softened. Verbal assurances had grown more frequent. And internal language around commercial alignment had sharpened. The drift wasn't catastrophic, but it was directional. That's what they never noticed. Preparation isn't about anticipating collapse. It's about recognizing slope. And by the time you see the bottom clearly, it's often too late to adjust gently. Daniel still believed control lived in influence. I understood that control lived in evidence. I had no desire for confrontation, but I was no longer operating under the assumption that internal narratives would protect me if pressure arrived. I was ready for scrutiny. What I didn't expect was how quickly scrutiny would become relevant, and from where the pressure would originate. Because the next move wouldn't be mine, it would be his, and it would come wrapped in something far less subtle than calibration. The leverage didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived in the form of an email sent at 9:42 p.m. on a Thursday. Subject line, professional alignment. I remember the timestamp because I looked at it for a long time before opening it. The message itself was concise. Daniel wrote that there had been growing concern among senior leadership about my commercial rigidity. He said my approach was creating internal friction and potentially damaging executive confidence. He suggested we discuss whether this environment remains the right fit for me. Then came the sentence that changed everything. If you continue escalating minor interpretive differences, I will have to address the perception externally. In this industry, reputation travels quickly. There it was. No feedback, not calibration. A threat, polished, indirect, but unmistakable. Address the perception externally. Reputation travels quickly. He wasn't threatening termination. He was a threatening narrative. In regulated industries, reputation is oxygen. It determines mobility, credibility, and trust with oversight bodies. He believed that because he had stronger relationships with certain executives, because he was more visible, he could shape how I would be described if I left. He believed influence outran documentation. He believed I would panic. I didn't. I read the email 3 times. Then I opened my notebook and wrote the date. What struck me most was not anger. It was a miscalculation. He had delivered in writing what he previously implied verbally. He had converted ambiguity into evidence, and he had done so voluntarily. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I archived the email into a separate encrypted folder where I stored personal documentation, separate from firm systems, not hidden, preserved. Then I revisited the past year's correspondence with new clarity. The pattern wasn't just risk tolerance drift. It was pressure sequencing, encourage flexibility, minimize documentation, frame caution as obstruction, suggest reputational consequences. It was incremental conditioning, and now it was explicit. I didn't celebrate. There was no sense of triumph, only understanding. Because leverage isn't about power over someone, it's about power over narrative. Daniel believed he could whisper doubt into the right rooms, and my credibility would erode. But what he hadn't accounted for was this. I was the head of compliance advisory on every file in question. If my professional integrity were publicly questioned, regulators would not view that as internal politics. They would view it as a signal, and regulators do not ignore signals about compliance friction. That was the quiet realization. If he attempted to damage my reputation externally, he would invite scrutiny into every documented deviation we had managed. He believed he was holding leverage. In reality, he had handed it to me. Because a written threat to manipulate perception in a regulated environment is not strategic. It's reckless. I drafted no angry reply. I didn't accuse him of intimidation. Instead, I wrote something measured. I'm committed to ensuring the firm remains fully defensible under regulatory review. If there are concerns about alignment, I welcome a structured discussion with HR present to clarify expectations and responsibilities. Calm, professional, documented. Then I closed my laptop and went home. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was afraid, because I understood something irreversible had occurred. The line was no longer blurry. It had been crossed. And once crossed, options narrow. He thought he was pressuring me into compliance. What he had actually done was remove ambiguity. And ambiguity is what keeps systems stable. Now the choice before me was no longer about internal harmony. It was about accountability. And accountability, once engaged, does not move quietly. There are moments in life when the options are technically multiple, but emotionally singular. After Daniel's email, I had choices. I could ignore the threat and continue as before. hoping it had been written in frustration rather than intent. I could escalate internally, file a grievance with HR, frame it as intimidation, let the company handle it discreetly. I could begin quietly searching for another role, exit gracefully, and allow whatever narrative he constructed to exist unchallenged. Each option had merit. Each option preserved a version of peace. But none addressed the core issue, because the problem wasn't that Daniel disliked my approach. The problem was that he had explicitly suggested shaping my external reputation in response to regulatory diligence. In a regulated industry that crosses different boundaries, if I allowed that sentence to pass without response, I would be participating in a culture where compliance can be pressured into silence and punished for resisting. That wasn't personal. It was structural. I spent the weekend reviewing documentation again. Not obsessively, calmly. Email threads, meeting summaries, policy updates I had authored, written confirmations of risk acceptance. I asked myself one clear question. If external oversight reviewed this record without context, would it raise concern? The answer wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't clean either. There was enough drift to warrant inquiry, and if Daniel ever followed through on his threat, if he implied externally that I was obstructive or misaligned, regulators would inevitably examine why, which meant the scrutiny would expand. I realized something then. The leverage wasn't about protecting myself from rumors. It was about controlling timing. If scrutiny was inevitable, it should begin before narrative manipulation could distort it. I didn't want a whisper campaign. I wanted documentation evaluated on its own terms, without emotional framing, without internal politics. So I researched reporting channels, not anonymously. Formally, every regulated firm is subject to oversight. There are established pathways for raising concerns about governance pressure, documentation interference, and reputational intimidation. They are not dramatic. They are procedural, and they are taken seriously. I drafted a summary, not accusatory, not emotional, just factual. Timeline of documented policy deviations, context of written warning regarding external perception, clarification that I was seeking guidance, not making allegations of illegality. I made sure every statement was supported by attached evidence. Then I sat with it, because once submitted, it would be irreversible. External inquiry changes internal dynamics permanently. It introduces neutrality. And neutrality is uncomfortable for those accustomed to shaping narrative internally. I thought about my career, about mobility, about how this might be perceived. Then I returned to something simple. My moral code has always been consistent. Protect the integrity of the system, even when individuals fail it. If I stayed silent to protect my own comfort, I would be contradicting the very standard I applied to everyone else. And if Daniel truly believed his actions were defensible, then scrutiny would validate that. I wasn't seeking punishment. I was seeking clarity. So on Monday morning, before the office filled, before meetings began, before Daniel could schedule another alignment conversation, I forwarded his email, along with my structured summary, to the industry regulator's formal reporting channel. Subject line: request for guidance regarding governance pressure. Clear, neutral, documented. An external investigation began before he could spread a single rumor. And that was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not publicly, but structurally. Because once oversight is engaged, narrative no longer belongs to individuals. It belongs to evidence. After I submitted the report, nothing happened. At least, nothing visible. No immediate acknowledgement beyond an automated confirmation of receipt. No dramatic phone call. No summons to an emergency board meeting. Just a quiet Tuesday morning. I attended our weekly leadership sync as usual. Daniel was relaxed, confident. He outlined quarterly projections with his usual composure. He even made a light joke about compliance keeping us honest. The room laughed. I took notes. If there is one misconception about regulatory oversight, it's that it moves loudly. It doesn't. It moves methodically. Over the next 10 days, I received 2 discrete communications from the regulator's office. One acknowledged the seriousness of reputational pressure linked to compliance independence. The other requested supplemental documentation, specifically around governance structure and documented policy deviations. No accusations, no conclusions, just an inquiry. I responded promptly, attaching files I had already organized. Again, calm, again, factual. Inside the firm, Daniel began escalating commercial initiatives with unusual speed. 2 new client proposals bypassed standard review sequencing. A third expansion plan was introduced with compressed deadlines. He seemed energized. Momentum often increases just before scrutiny lands. Especially when someone senses internal tension but misidentifies its source. He likely assumed my calm meant retreat. He likely believed the weekend had cooled any reaction. He did not know that an external review was already underway. I didn't change my behavior. I continued asking precise questions in meetings. I continued sending confirmation emails after verbal directives. Just to confirm, per our earlier discussion, please advise if you'd like this recorded as a formal exception. There's something powerful about continuing routine when circumstances have fundamentally shifted, because routine conceals transformation. About 2 weeks after submission, the firm received a formal notice. It was addressed to the board. Subject: preliminary governance inquiry. The wording was neutral. The tone is procedural. It referenced routine sector-wide reviews of compliance-independent structures and documentation practices. Sector-wide, not personalized, not accusatory, but precise. Daniel forwarded the notice to the executive team with a brief message. Standard regulatory engagement. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. I watched his posture in the next meeting. Still confident, but slightly sharper. He asked me, almost casually, "Have you had any recent direct contact with them?" I met his eyes evenly. As part of my role, I maintain open communication channels. True. Accurate. Incomplete. He nodded. Good. Let's make sure messaging is aligned. Messaging. He still believed this was narrative management. What he didn't understand was that once regulators initiate an inquiry, messaging is secondary to documentation. Over the next few days, internal document requests intensified. Board members began asking for summaries of compliance exceptions over the past 18 months. HR requested clarification on reporting lines and independent safeguards. Daniel's emails became shorter, more cautious. He scheduled fewer verbal-only conversations. Suddenly, documentation mattered again. And here is the quiet truth. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, because the objective had never been to destabilize him. It was to stabilize the system. If scrutiny cleared us, the firm would emerge stronger. If scrutiny identified drift, correction would follow. Either outcome was healthier than intimidation disguised as alignment. Daniel had believed he could manage perception externally before it crystallized. Instead, external review began before he could spread a single rumor. And rumors are powerless when evidence arrives first. The consequences hadn't fully surfaced yet, but they were approaching, slowly, procedurally, irreversibly. Consequences rarely arrive with accusation. They arrive with questions. The first real shift wasn't loud. It was subtle. A change in tone during a board meeting I was invited to attend. Previously, compliance updates were allocated 10 minutes at the end of the agenda. That week, they were placed second. Second, before revenue, before expansion, before projections. The board chair's voice was measured. We've received notice of a sector-wide governance inquiry. We'd like clarity on our documentation processes and independent safeguards. Daniel answered first. Of course. Our compliance function is strong. Zara has been meticulous. Meticulous. The word carried a different weight now. It was no longer a mild critique. It was an asset. I was asked to walk through our documentation framework. I did so calmly, outlining policy update timelines, exception logging procedures, and written confirmations of risk acceptance. I referenced archived communications without emotion. I did not mention the email. I did not mention the warning. I didn't need to, because once documentation is reviewed, patterns speak for themselves. Over the next week, independent auditors requested access to decision trails on 3 specific client accelerations. The same accelerations Daniel had championed, the same ones I had documented carefully. There were no accusations of illegality, but there were follow-up questions. Who approved this deviation? Was enhanced due diligence formally waived? Was board-level sign-off recorded? Each answer required written evidence. Each answer led back to email chains, and in those chains language mattered. Per management direction, as discussed. Formal risk acknowledgement attached. Daniel began calling fewer spontaneous meetings. When he did speak to me, his tone was cautious, almost conciliatory. "We'll get through this smoothly," he said once. "We will," I replied evenly, because scrutiny is not punishment. It is illumination. Within the broader executive team, tension surfaced quietly. A CFO, who had once rushed timelines, now asked for confirmation twice. A director who had joked about my risk radar now requested early involvement before presentations were finalized. Loss was being felt, but not understood. Loss of speed, loss of certainty, loss of the informal elasticity that had made decisions feel effortless. Daniel appeared slightly more restrained each day. He wasn't panicking, but he was recalculating. In one meeting, he corrected himself mid-sentence. We can interpret that flexibly. I mean, we should check the policy language first. That correction said more than any apology could. Meanwhile, HR initiated a routine review of compliance reporting independence. The phrasing was clinical, neutral, but structural adjustments were being discussed. Reporting lines reconsidered. Escalation pathways clarified. The system was tightening, not around a person, but around a process. And the process doesn't bend easily once reinforced. I remained steady. Not triumphant, not cold, just consistent, because this was never about exposing him. It was about removing ambiguity. Consequences were unfolding, not through confrontation, but through inquiry. An inquiry is uncomfortable for those who rely on influence rather than documentation. The shift in power wasn't visible in raised voices. It was visible who now needed written confirmation. It was visible in who waited before approving. It was visible in who checked the language twice. Daniel still held his title, still attended leadership dinners, still projected composure. But the invisible advantage he once believed he had, control over narrative, was dissolving. Because once oversight engages, perception no longer outruns paper. And paper in regulated industries carries memory. The consequences had begun, not explosively, but structurally. The moment he realized it wasn't routine came quietly. About 3 weeks into the inquiry, the regulator requested recorded copies of executive meeting minutes. Not summaries, not highlights, full transcripts. That level of detail is not standard in a casual review. It signals pattern analysis. Daniel's composure didn't fracture, but it thinned. In a closed executive session, he asked, carefully, whether anyone had direct knowledge of what triggered the inquiry. His tone was analytical, not accusatory. The room was silent for a moment. No one answered, because no one knew. And that uncertainty is heavier than blame. He began revisiting past decisions, reframing them as collaborative interpretations rather than directional pushes. In emails, he added phrases like, following compliance guidance, in alignment with policy language. Language was shifting backward, trying to retrofit alignment. But documentation preserves chronology, and chronology cannot be rewritten without leaving seams. HR's review of reporting lines intensified. I was invited to a separate meeting, not confrontational, just exploratory. Do you feel you've had sufficient independence in your role? The question was neutral. I answered neutrally. My documentation reflects my position at all times. I didn't mention the threat, not yet, because the investigation was not about emotion. It was about structure. Daniel requested a private meeting with me 2 days later, the first since his email. He closed the door this time. He didn't lean casually against the desk. He sat. I want to make sure we're aligned, he began. Aligned. The word had returned. He spoke about protecting the firm's reputation, about presenting unified messaging, about how regulatory reviews can spiral if not managed carefully. Then he paused. If there were any misunderstandings between us, he said slowly, now would be a good time to clarify them. Misunderstandings. The word hovered carefully. I looked at him calmly. There's nothing unclear in my documentation. The sentence wasn't sharp. It was precise. He studied my face, searching perhaps for anger, for hostility, for leverage he could negotiate against. There was none, just steadiness. He realized then, I think, that whatever mechanism he believed he could adjust internally had already moved beyond him. Because once a regulator requests transcripts, the process belongs to them. And influence has no jurisdiction there. Over the next week, auditors conducted interviews across departments. Not interrogations, structured conversations. Questions about pressure, about timing, about documentation integrity. No one was accused, but everyone felt recalibrated. Daniel's language became careful in ways it had never been before. He CC'd compliance earlier. He requested written confirmation before moving forward on initiatives he once accelerated instinctively. It was too late to re-engineer history, because history was archived. He never confronted me directly about the email. He didn't need to. The silence between us carried acknowledgement. The narrative control he once implied, the external shaping of perception, was no longer his to wield. Now the firm's reputation depended not on charisma, but on paper, and paper had been preserved. Panic didn't erupt dramatically. It diffused slowly through realization, through tightened shoulders, through shortened emails, through meetings where no one joked about risk radar anymore. By the time the board began discussing structural changes to compliance independence formally, Daniel's confidence had shifted into something more restrained. He wasn't undone. but he was exposed to the process. And the process does not negotiate retroactively. It reviews. It assesses. It concludes. Whatever outcome would come, it would not be shaped by whisper. It would be shaped by evidence. And evidence had already arrived. The final conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon. Not because I requested it, because the board had concluded its internal restructuring review. Compliance would now report directly to the board's risk committee, functionally independent from commercial leadership. It was framed as governance strengthening, sector alignment, best practice modernization. Daniel asked to speak with me after the announcement. His office felt smaller than I remembered. He didn't attempt informality this time. He sat across from me, hands folded loosely. "I suppose," he began, "this structure benefits your position." It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't generous either. Just factual. "It benefits the firm," I replied. A pause. He nodded once. "You went to them." It wasn't a question. I held his gaze. I requested guidance regarding governance pressure. Still calm. Still precise. He exhaled slowly. Not sharply, just measured. "You could have come to me." "I did," I said gently. "In documentation." That was the closest either of us came to confrontation. There was no anger in the room. No raised voices. Just acknowledgement of the sequence. He leaned back slightly. "I never intended to damage your reputation." "I preserved mine," I replied. Silence followed. Not hostile. Just clear. The difference between us had never been emotional. It was philosophical. He believed narrative could be managed through influence. I believed integrity was maintained through the record. He had tested whether perception could override documentation. It couldn't. The regulator's inquiry eventually concluded without catastrophic findings, but with mandated adjustments, enhanced documentation standards, explicit sign-off requirements, clearer independent safeguards. Nothing dramatic, but irreversible. Daniel retained his role, though narrower in scope. Decision pathways that once flowed through him now required formal compliance concurrence at the board level. Speed had been replaced with structure. He looked at me one last time before I stood to leave. "You've always been steady," he said quietly. "I've always been consistent," I corrected softly. Steadiness can be misread as passivity. Consistency cannot. There was no victory in the room. No defeat either. Just consequence. As I walked back to my office, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief, not triumph, alignment. For the first time in months, the system and my role within it were structurally coherent. No more implied threats. No more whispered warnings about perception. If someone disagreed with my assessment, it would be debated openly and recorded. That was all I ever wanted. Confrontation doesn't require heat. Sometimes it requires stillness. And stillness, when backed by documentation, is difficult to destabilize. It has been 8 months since the restructuring. Externally, very little appears dramatic. I still arrive at the office early. I still carry the same black leather notebook. I still speak in measured tones during meetings. But internally, everything is different. Compliance now reports directly to the board's risk committee. Escalations are documented as standard practice, not perceived as friction. Early involvement is no longer optional. It is embedded. And interestingly, the atmosphere has grown calmer. When boundaries are clear, tension decreases. Daniel and I work together professionally. There is no hostility between us. Our conversations are shorter, more precise, and almost formal. We do not reference what happened. We don't need to, because structure has replaced ambiguity. What changed most, however, wasn't the reporting line. It was my identity within the system. For years, I allowed myself to be perceived as supporting infrastructure. Essential, but background. Now I understand something more nuanced. Infrastructure is power. Not loud power, not charismatic power, but foundational power. Without it, nothing scales safely. I no longer rationalize staying quiet as diplomacy. I speak when necessary, and I document when essential, without apology for either. There's no edge in my tone, no bitterness in my posture. If anything, I feel lighter, because integrity no longer depends on personal resilience. It's codified. The most surprising outcome is how others treat me now. Junior analysts seek mentorship openly. Board members request my input earlier in strategic planning. Even commercial teams approach compliance as collaborative architecture rather than a final checkpoint. Respect didn't arrive because I demanded it. It arrived because the system now reflects the value of the function. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson. I never needed to dominate a room. I never needed to embarrass anyone. I never needed to win publicly. I needed alignment between responsibility and authority. That alignment exists now. Occasionally I think about that email, the line about reputation traveling quickly. It does. But so does consistency. A reputation built on documentation is slower, but it's harder to dismantle. I don't see Daniel as a villain. He operated within a framework that rewarded speed and narrative control. I operated within one that valued defensibility and record. When those philosophies collided, the stronger structure prevailed. Not because I was louder, because I was prepared. I am no longer the quiet stabilizer in the corner. I am the architect of the guardrails, and guardrails don't shout. They simply hold. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Silence is not weakness, but silence without structure is vulnerability. For a long time, I believed that integrity alone would protect me, that doing the right thing consistently would naturally create safety. And while integrity matters, it must be paired with documentation, boundaries, and the willingness to act when a line is crossed. My manager threatened to destroy my industry reputation. I forwarded the threat to the industry regulator. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but accountability belongs to systems, not personalities. An external investigation began before he could spread a single rumor, and that timing changed everything. There were no dramatic showdowns, no public humiliations, no careers were destroyed overnight. What happened instead was quieter and more powerful. Governance tightened, documentation strengthened, independence clarified. The system corrected itself, and I remained exactly who I had always been. The difference is that now, my steadiness is understood as authority, not accommodation. If you're in a position where your professionalism is being reframed as obstruction, pause before reacting emotionally. Ask yourself, is the issue interpersonal or structural? If it's structural, don't argue louder. Document better. Seek guidance through the right channels. Act before narrative outruns evidence. Because once reputation becomes a threat, clarity must become your response. You don't need to dominate to protect yourself. You need to align your actions with your values. And be prepared to stand behind the record you create. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace, only to realize later that peace required structure, not accommodation? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.